This does look like a change of tack and a terrifying one at that, with the second mass air attack in days across Ukraine. What do you think is going on here?
It's not a change particularly. This has been going on since September, and it's been pretty sustained, and it has a pretty clear objective, which is to make life as miserable as possible through the winter for ordinary Ukrainians. The claim is that this will in some way affect the ability of the forces at the front to operate, but the evidence that we have and what the Ukrainians say is it doesn't make actually much difference to them, except they're worried about their families back home. But it's causing a lot of misery. So it doesn't actually help Russia gain its war aims,
Or,
but it does sort of punish them for carrying on resisting Russian aggression.
so if it doesn't help Russia, meet its war aims, where is Putin going with this?
Well, he obviously thinks it will, and along with the pressure on Western Europe because of the energy crunch, he's sort of waiting for something to turn up. I think the other thing that he's hoping for is that the mobilisation, which is the other big news of September, is now sort of better organised and having an effect. So this has allowed Russian forces to stabilise the front lines. And as you mentioned in the news, the Ukrainians are worried that by the spring they may be in a position to return to the offensive with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of new troops ready to march. The problem, I think, is that first there's quite a long way for the Russians to get there before the spring, and the Ukrainians aren't stopping fighting for the winter. And secondly, there's no particular reason to believe these troops are going to be fully kitted out and properly trained, but just the sheer numbers make a difference.
And what do you make of the Ukrainians' warnings that Putin's going to try again to take Kyiv in the new year? Is that plausible?
I think the Russians would find that very difficult, but the part of the difficulty that we're in at the moment is Russia can't achieve its war aims, but Putin can't admit he's lost. So he wants to keep the war going in the hope that something will turn up. And there may come a point where the Ukrainians don't quite have the military support that they've been having from the West, maybe just because supplies are drying up. And they've built up their capabilities again, and maybe they can return to what they tried before. But it seems to me that's quite unlikely. But you can see why the Ukrainians are worried. And I think what the Ukrainians are trying to do is to remind their supporters, international supporters, that though the front lines seem rather sort of stalemated at the moment, the conflict hasn't got away, and they still need support. They obviously need support with their defences, so that they get an even higher rate of attrition of these missiles coming in at them, and they want more support so they can continue with their offensive action, especially as when the ground freezes more and the tanks will find it easier to move.
We'll come back to the Western support in just a second, but seem to remember last time we spoke a few months back, you expressed some hope that perhaps the beginning of the end could come sooner than expected because of the Russian mistakes. Are you less hopeful now? Does everything we're seeing point to a much more protracted sort of war of attrition?
Yeah, I'm less hopeful, largely because I think there was some grounds for hope in September that the Russian military and never mind the politicians, because it was always going to be difficult for Putin, would realize the difficulty that they were in and accept that there's no way that this war can actually be won. And I think that remains the position. But I think Putin made a number of decisions there to launch these attacks on infrastructure, to mobilize the population much more, and also to increase his war aims so that the four provinces, in addition to Crimea, of Ukraine were annexed, which makes it much harder to imagine what a deal looks like at the moment. Russia is claiming that any deal has to be based on recognition of this sort of partition of Ukraine, even though Ukraine is actually controlling quite a bit of the territory that Russia has supposedly annexed. So when you might have hoped that they would look for a way out of this sort of catastrophic conflict, which isn't really going anywhere for Russia, that they double down instead. And so I think we're now looking at something that could. I mean, it's very hard to predict its end. It's very. I mean, my view remains it's very hard for both sides to sustain the war at the level it's been
Mm.
fought over this year. But it could dribble on without a very clear resolution.
And then that comes back to Western resolve, because we've seen reports about the US sending long range Patriot defense systems.
Yeah.
Could these latest sort of attacks by Russia see NATO increasingly drawn into more sort of provocative action? You know, the US
Well, I don't
unwittingly,
think you can
perhaps.
get more.
Mm.
I don't think you can get more provocative than the Russians are being.
Mm.
So, and that, and one of the consequences of that is that you've seen that incrementally, but significantly, the level of NATO support go up, and the uh, and systems that were sort of ruled out earlier in the war now being considered, and the Patriot air defense missiles are the latest of those. Again, none of these are magic. They don't. They're all helping. The biggest issue is just keeping up levels of ammunition and artillery. That's
Which is
how
depleting
much
our
of
own
it.
resources.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, I mean, you're now starting to see quite urgent efforts to crank up defense production in the West because, otherwise the cupboard's going to be completely bare if we're not careful.
Mm.
So there's a real challenge there. And Ukrainians are looking for ways to improve to produce more weapons. That's what happens in a war. You use up stuff.
Yeah.
The Russians, of course, are going to the Iranians to get drones.
And you've seen, Putin talking to the Indian President Narendra
Mm.
Modi today, and he's visiting Belarus. But
Yeah.
in his own country, he's increasingly absent. He's missing the traditional ice hockey match. He's cancelled the annual press conference. Do you read anything into that?
Well, I think he cancelled the annual press conference because he didn't want to be asked too many awkward questions. Historically, there's been a degree of latitude for journalists in that, and it's not that Putin's been particularly coy about talking about the war, but these press conferences used to go on for a very long time, and I don't think he would want something that potentially could get a bit out of control. I think people will be watching to see if he gives his annual New Year address. That's probably the next thing to see. He's in a difficult position. He's tried to explain to his people now that this could go on for a long time. It's not the quick special military operation he had in mind in February. And there's evidence of concern and dissatisfaction within Russia.
There's
Uh,
also rumours that he's ill, and there have
well,
been for a while.
there's been rumours for the start that he's been ill, and he may well be, but um,
He's still
there are
there.
they're no more than rumours. He hobbles a bit. His
Yeah,
face looks puffy, but I don't think if he is, we'll find out eventually. But you can't
right.
draw large conclusions at the moment from it.